Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Lyle Seligson and I'm a sophomore at the college, and I'm also a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. The Institute of Politics is excited to be a part of this fall's Harvard Votes Challenge, a voter registration competition between Harvard schools. For more information, see the inside of your program. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag Sherman Gibbs Forum, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming IOP Director Mark Guerin and our guests, Ambassador Wendy R. Sherman and Nancy Gibbs.
Good evening. We warmly welcome all of you here to tonight's John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum with our very welcomed guest, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, who will be in conversation with Nancy Gibbs. This is a special night for the Institute of Politics because we have two friends of the Institute here in conversation of the issues of the day, and we have a lot of issues of the day that we can all unpack here. But I come up in a special way in preface to Nancy's introduction, and the bios are before you, so I will not rehearse them. But I'm in, on behalf of the Institute of Politics, and welcoming Ambassador Sherman back here. Since Dean Elmendorf has announced her appointment to direct the Center for Public Leadership, we're thrilled to be able to welcome her when she officially arrives in January. She, of course, is a former IOP fellow and someone I've personally had the good fortune to work with in politics and in government. So as we welcome him here to the forum in a special way, we look forward to her continued presence and official permanent presence here in January. And we thank Nancy Gibbs for being in conversation with Ambassador Sherman, because she will bring all of her requisite skills and background from editing time to her important work here at the Kennedy School. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Wendy. As Mark said, all the biographical detail you could ever want and then some is in your programs, but what you will see and what's exciting about tonight is to be here with a woman of many lives, a social worker, community organizer, Emily's List director, campaign manager, ambassador, global business strategist, and the first woman to hold the number 3 position at the State Department, and in that position, the lead negotiator of the Iran nuclear deal. But for our parochial purposes, most exciting, the new director of CPL. This represents your debut in the forum in that position, so let's start with the news. Tell me what made you decide that the Kennedy School and the center was the right next step for you?
It wasn't something I went looking for, actually. Someone, actually Graham Allison, suggested that I consider it. And I said, okay, because one thing I've learned in life is that you should never say no. You should be open to whatever opportunities come your way. Some of the best things that have happened to me in my life were completely unexpected. So I keep hearing an echo of myself, whoever's doing the audio. I started to talk with Doug Elmendorf and with David Gergen. I've known David for a very long time. And the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about where we were in our country and where we were in the world, and what I had done with my life, I thought that leadership was at a very crucial point for our country, not just because of the recent election, which certainly says a lot about the nature of leadership, but I think all over the world there's a challenge of leadership. There's a challenge of leadership at the governmental level. There's a challenge of leadership in business because business is undergoing enormous disruption, which when you were editor of Time magazine you covered a great deal of. So things are changing, and what's expected of leaders is very different in business. Civil society is probably the most vibrant place for leadership. When we see in our own country leadership coming from the Parkland students We see leadership coming from women who march. We see leadership coming from kids in Chicago who want to make sure they can live the next day. And we see leadership in the community worried about whether they can stay in this country or keep their kids safe or be sent back home. I think it's incumbent on all of us to spend some time thinking about the nature of leadership, what we want, what we expect of our leaders, what makes a good leader, and try to lift up all of the people who are trying to do good things and marry it up with the research that goes on here. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I'll say, the most fundamental part of all of this is Harvard and the Kennedy School is supposed to be about raising, in part, the next generation of leaders. A lot of people come to the Kennedy School in the graduate program who already have some experience, and they're looking to go back to their home cities, states, countries, businesses, NGOs, and take the next step in their leadership. And I want to say, as he's walking into the room, speaking of great leaders, David Gergen and Julie Kayem. Thank you both.
Do you, given the challenge you've taken on, and everything you say about the importance of bringing talented people into public leadership, I couldn't agree with more. Are you concerned, as we were reminded again in the last 2 weeks, of what felt at times like gladiatorial combat, that even as the stakes and the importance are so high, that the obstacles are too, and that what public figures now face in terms of the kind of criticism, the kind of harassment, the fair and unfair kinds of attacks that they face acts as a deterrent to. How do you navigate that when you're bringing students into this arena?
Leadership, as I wrote, though we're not here to talk specifically about the book I just wrote, but it isn't for the faint of heart. In 1991, I spent the weekend with Anita Hill, trying to help her navigate the Congress. She had a fabulous legal team, but some mutual friends asked if I would help her and her team out because they knew nothing about the Congress. It was one of the most searing, dismal weekends of my life. Then Senator Joe Biden, who was chairman of the Judiciary Committee at the time, thought he was conducting a hearing. And Arlen Specter, who was the ranking member, thought he was conducting a trial. The trial won. It was a devastating, devastating weekend. And just this past week, when I was going through some old files, because I'm trying to unpack our house in Washington to bring some of it here to Cambridge, I found a cartoon in the Baltimore Sun, which is where I'm from, in 1991. It had Arlen Specter, Senator Simpson, and Senator Hatch in sort of beat-em-up clothes with bludgeons in their hands and whips, and a woman lying across the floor, and the bubble is, I don't understand why she didn't come forward sooner. And I tweeted out that cartoon because it is the same narrative, it's the same script. And on one level, it depresses the hell out of me. But on the other hand, it reminds me that the courage to take on these fights means there's going to be a lot of failure along the way, and if it's the right thing to do, one has to keep fighting for it. So what I come out of this really awful battle that we just had is a stronger sense of fighting on for what I believe is important. And I think we all need to do that. The difficulty none of us have the answer to is how you do that in a way that ultimately brings people together rather than further ripping them apart. And that is a hard task.
We're marking this week 1 year since the publication of the Harvey Weinstein accusations and the Me Too movement going as broad as it did. As you think back your Anita Hill experience and what you watched? Are you more struck by how much has changed or how much hasn't?
I think we're in a really complicated time, and it's not just in the United States, it's all over the world. In early 2000, the Pew Global Attitudes Project, which I was a consultant for them and my husband still works for now, did a poll of 44 countries around the world. And people loved what they got from globalization. Better pharmaceutical choices, better food choices, American blue jeans. The Vietnamese loved, 90% loved cell phones. Only 10% of them had cell phones, but they loved the thought of cell phones and being connected to the world. But at the same time, particularly in emerging markets, people were concerned about losing their way of life, losing their identity, that modernity would mean that they would no longer know where they stood in the world and who they were. I think that anxiety has come home to the developed world. And whether it's Europe and Brexit, or what's happening in Hungary and the Czech Republic and Poland, or what's happened in our country, pardon me for the caricature in part, but that 55-year-old white guy in the middle of our country who lost his manufacturing job still has to put 2 kids through college, take a computer coding course. After 2 years, he'll earn half of what he did. His wife, who he wanted to support and didn't want to see at work, whether we think that's right or wrong, is now at work because she has to be. The people who are in his neighborhood no longer look like him. They're brown, not white. The people down the street who he thought were very nice people, now they can get married. And he doesn't know what happened to his world. He doesn't know where he stands. And his wife is concerned about him. His daughter's concerned about him. And that anxiety was picked up by Donald Trump very effectively. I'm obviously not a supporter of Donald Trump's, quite the opposite. But he picked up that anxiety and that sense of, I've been betrayed by my country. And he just went at it and worked that division, worked that anger, and worked that frustration to his benefit. That, of course, only exacerbates fear, only exacerbates anxiety. It doesn't help heal that anxiety. And so we end up with a country that is split, though the majority of people, I think, are quite comfortable. And I think there are generational issues here as well. I think younger people are in a very different place than people of my generation. And that's why my great hope is in people a lot younger than I am.
Well, you talked about the challenge of addressing these issues while bringing people together, and I think for the first time, if you have a president who revels in division, but succeeds through it. I mean, ultimately, this has worked. This was successful, and in the case of this latest drama, getting the justice that he wanted. So how do you both win and unite when right now winning has involved dividing?
I think the winning is short-termism, though certainly Kavanaugh on the court has extraordinarily profound long-term consequences that worry me tremendously. Most predominantly on 2 issues: that the Supreme Court not say that presidents have unfettered power. They don't under our Constitution, but I'm fearful that we're headed in that direction. And secondly, of course, in my own view, that Roe v. Wade not be overturned or nullified in some way, which I sadly see quite possible. But I think that most of what the president has done is very short term, and it all has consequences. We have isolated ourselves from the rest of the world. One of my great concerns, and I was talking with David about this today, I am profoundly disturbed by Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance. Jamal Khashoggi, for those of you who don't know, is a journalist, a contributor to the Washington Post, a really phenomenal writer, a Saudi citizen, but is resident in the U.S., putatively under U.S. protection in some ways. And he went to the Turkish consulate, the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, to get papers to prove he had been divorced because he wants to marry a Turkish woman. He never left. He never has been seen again since he went inside the consulate. There are many stories saying that the Saudis killed him inside that consulate, or took him away and killed him, or killed him, to be perfectly frank, not to disturb everyone too much, but dismembered him, put him in boxes, and carted him out of the country. It is simply extraordinary. And our government, in my view, has not taken the steps they ought to. I hope they're doing something in private I don't know about. But although I do not hold the president responsible if the Saudis have done this, and we don't know for certain yet, I do believe that the president, this gets to your point, I'm getting to your point, the president's saying that the press is the enemy of the people, which is very much the language of Stalin and very much the language of authoritarian and dictatorial leaders, allows countries to then, with impunity, do things they otherwise might not do, when the United States provided leadership to say, these things are not what we do in the civilized world.
You raise a point then that we've been talking a lot about this semester at the Kennedy School, which is about civility. And a situation like you're describing is yet one more reason why many people will say this may not be the time for civility. This is an emergency. Civility is lovely, but we can't afford it right now. And this is how you have a spectacle of protesters who are being called mobs, but who are feeling like they need to be seen and heard, and if that involves interrupting someone's dinner, so be it. And so we're having this fascinating conversation about everything from what works tactically to what is effective to what is appropriate. How would you guide people who feel like they need to protest, make their voices heard at a time like this in an environment like this?
I think it's crucial that people's voices are heard. I think it's crucial that if it means being in the streets, we're in the streets. I certainly think the first thing we need to do is make sure everybody you know is registered to vote, and they go vote on November 6th, so that there is some balance of power that is restored in our government. There is none at the moment. But I don't kid myself, the next 2 years, if the Democrats take over the House, will be hideous. They'll be completely ugly, because the Democrats will have a hearing every single day, will subpoena members of the administration. The administration may not pay attention to those subpoenas. There will be court efforts. It will end up at the Supreme Court somewhere along the way. It will be ugly. We have, I'm lucky enough not to put her on the spot, to have my daughter in the audience who helps to run the clinic on immigration rights and human trafficking at Boston University's law school, and tells me stories every day of 6-year-olds and 2-year-olds who find themselves sitting in a seat in court talking about why they can't get back to their parents. I mean, who have we become when we have, I have 2 little grandsons, 3 and 5 years old. I can't imagine them sitting in a seat telling a judge they need to be back with their mother. Who are we? So I think we are going to have to go through a hard time. I hope it doesn't lead to violence. I don't think violence solves these problems. But I came of political age in the 60s, and I left Smith College to go to Boston University for several reasons, but one of them was it was during the Vietnam War, and I couldn't sit in Northampton and drink Constant Common tea. I wanted to be on the streets marching every week. So I went to Boston University, I finished my degree, I never went to graduation, I protested, and adults, not my parents in particular, because they were pretty radical as parents go, but when we said the CIA was keeping tabs on us, everybody said that wasn't true, but of course they were. So it was a terribly violent time. There were students killed at Kent State. Folks who went to register people to vote in the South were killed. We had 5 assassinations, a president-to-be, 3 civil rights leaders, bombs in Manhattan townhouses. So it was a hard time, but out of that time, we got Richard Nixon and Watergate. Ronald Reagan and Graham Latta, but we also got the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the women's movement, the end of the Vietnam War. So we all have to look at this over time, and I don't think it's a time for people to sit on their butts. I think it is a time to speak up and have courage, and it's going to be rough.
But do you think there were some forms of speaking up that backfire? Are there smarter ways that you would like to see more of, that you don't feel are being utilized?
Well, I'd like to see everybody vote. Millennials vote at a lower percentage than any other similar cohort in history. People think young people vote because young people showed up for Barack Obama. But even so, millennials in 2016, a smaller percentage than any other previous cohort of that age. So I want everybody to register. I want everybody to vote. I want people to do whatever they can to stop voter suppression efforts, whether that's in the courts or whether that's being monitors at the polling places, whether that is working with state legislatures to stop legislation around voter suppression, to do everything we can. So for me, the first thing is everybody vote, because people have power in their vote. They have power in their vote. So that's where I'd start.
It was fascinating about a month ago now when the New York Times decided to run the op-ed from the identified senior administration official, taking issue with not so much the policies of the administration, but talking about internal forms of resistance. Have you ever found yourself having to make decisions about how you serve when in an administration, or implement policies that you may not
Absolutely.
fully subscribe to?
So when I was the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs in the State Department under Warren Christopher and Bill Clinton as president, we were standing aside while Bosnia fell apart. And I had to go up to Capitol Hill and defend the administration. One morning, I saw in the intelligence the mass grave at Srebrenica. And I went down to see Christopher, and I said, Mr. Secretary, I can't keep going up to Capitol Hill and doing this. And so if the administration's policy is not going to change, I'm not going to be able to do this job much longer. And fortunately, he agreed. Fortunately, the president agreed. Madeleine Albright, who was our UN ambassador at the time, we got those photographs declassified, took them to the UN, and US policy changed. And it changed on a bipartisan basis. Bob Dole, who was the majority leader in the Senate, worked with the Democrats to really move Bosnia policy in quite a different direction. So yes, and there isn't a week that goes by that someone from the State Department doesn't come to see me or calls and says, I'm not sure I can stay. That was certainly true when Secretary Tillerson was Secretary of State. And what I always say is stay as long as you can, because we need your knowledge and your experience, and particularly if you're not a very high level, you can do a lot of good work under the radar. But if you get to a day where you can't, and certainly our deputy chief of mission in China decided that he believes how climate change is incredibly important. If you live in Beijing, you know that because you can't breathe. So he felt he could not stay in an administration where climate change is called a hoax. So yes, Tony Lake and Dick Holbrook, known to lots of people here, left the administration over the Vietnam War. They were Foreign Service officers and didn't feel they could serve.
We should do a quick tour of the world, because you have such insight into so many of the most important challenges right now. Secretary of State is just back from North and South Korea and Japan and China, where he mud wrestled with his counterpart there, promising another summit with North Korea in the very near future. What do you make of that?
Well, what I make of it is that he wants to keep this moving forward. I supported his having the first Singapore summit because Kim Jong-un, I don't know him, but I knew his father, Kim Jong-il, and spent several hours with him in North Korea during the end of the Clinton administration. And North Korean leaders believe they are the only ones that matter because actually in their system they are the only ones that matter, because if they don't get cooperation, they kill you. So Kim Jong-un, 2 weeks after he became leader of North Korea, killed his uncle and his uncle's family because he thought his uncle was challenging his power. So it is more a cult in North Korea than it is a country. And President Trump believes he's the only one who matters. Now, he was the only one elected president. That is true, but we do have checks and balances. But he still believes he is the ultimate decider. So I thought, well, maybe these two ultimate deciders could get in a room and get someplace different. But I also said it needed to be well prepared. There had to be a plan. There had to be a team ready to go. They had to really think through all the steps, quite closely coordinated with our allies and partners. Very little of that happened. So we got a summit with the thinnest summit document I have ever seen, thinner than any document by the South Koreans, the Japanese, us, with North Korea ever. When Secretary Pompeo took over, he took responsibility for a lot of this. He did bring in recently Steve Biegun, who I know quite well as a special envoy, very capable, very competent person. But what I've said is, although Steve is a very good negotiator, very good at what he does, when I negotiated with North Korea, when I negotiated with Iran or Cuba or in the Middle East or anywhere in the world, I knew the president would not pull the rug out from under me. I knew what the right and left margins were of our policy and how far I could go. There is no way that Steve can have that assurance because, as Nikki Haley, who just left, found out when she talked about how there were going to be more sanctions against Russia, and the president said, not really. And one of her colleagues said, well, she was confused, and her response was, I am not confused. You just don't know. You just don't know. So I think the second summit, I think it's very interesting. The president just announced he won't do it till after the midterms. I think the risks were too high for him, and he wants to run around the country having rallies to try to whip up support for the Republicans holding onto the House and the Senate. So I don't think much will come out of the second summit. My guess is they will allow inspectors into the site where they've already exploded the mountain. We won't be able to tell much. The president is likely to agree to a political declaration of the end of the war. We won't get enough in return for his doing that. So he is right to say there should be no immediate timeline on this because this is an extraordinarily difficult problem. But I don't have much hope.
Your book, which is called Not for the Faint of Heart, and there are signed copies in Coop, and I recommend it to you, although I will say it was to follow you through the extraordinarily arduous path of the Iran nuclear deal, which you called the world's most complex and consequential Rubik's Cube. Made me wonder whether, apart from everything else, we have a complexity problem with our truncated attention spans, and that even bringing the public into debating the merits of not the fine details you were dealing with, but just even the basic dimensions of the stakes of a deal like that has become so difficult. And it's so much easier for a president to say, well, it's a terrible deal, I'll make a better one. What has it been like for you, given particularly what you put into that, to watch what has occurred since?
Well, once Donald Trump became president, it was probably a matter of time before he pulled out because he made withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal so much a part of his campaign. And I think National Security Advisor McMaster and General Mattis, Secretary Mattis of Defense Department, and even Secretary Tillerson told him, well, don't certify the deal, but leave the sanctions off. And he did that, but as soon as McMaster and Tillerson were gone, Mattis, I think, could not hold it up and John Bolton has never seen a war he didn't want to wage, so he didn't like the deal. And so it was only a matter of time. I was actually in Malta Valletta the day he pulled out of it. And I was walking the streets of Valletta, and my phone rang. It was John Kerry, who I think just wanted to commiserate and sort of us egg each other on not to give up. It's painful, and it's painful for the hundreds of people who worked on it. These things don't happen just because of the president or John Kerry or Ernie Moniz or me or even the 15-member core team. Hundreds of people in the US government, hundreds of people in the UK government, the French government, the German government, the Chinese government, the Russian government, let alone the Iranian government, worked on this deal. So it takes thousands of people to do these complicated deals. And but the real pain of this is I don't think it makes us more secure. I think it makes us less secure. And Secretary Mattis, who is no fan of Iran and didn't want the deal in the first place, thought the deal should stay, and he believes since the president withdrew, things have gotten worse in the Middle East, not better. And so he doesn't feel like we have the levers to get there. I don't know what's going to happen. The Europeans are trying to hold this together. They're trying to create a special facility to try to fund business, small and medium business, to stay in Iran. I do see the Iranians when they come to New York. They're only allowed in a 25-mile radius of the United Nations and can only come here on official business, so I go to New York and see them. Even though Secretary Pompeo has called Secretary Kerry, Secretary Moniz, and me traitors for talking with the Iranians, we go and we say, stay in the deal, don't get nuclear weapons, stop doing what you're doing in the Middle East, let the Americans out of Evin prison and get them home. I mean, it's, we're patriots, for heaven's sakes. But I think the Iranians are going to think hard about what's going to happen in our country and how long they can hold on.
You talking about how Secretary Kerry devoted enormous amounts of time and energy to developing personal relationships, which played a huge role in moving that deal forward. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether, since the president talks all the time about the personal relationships that he has developed with different leaders around the world, as though diplomacy is entirely about those relationships. When is that essential? When is it potentially a diversion from what really matters in a successful diplomatic outcome?
It's not an end in itself. It's a tool. And you can't, you have to find common ground with the people in a room, the people across the table from you. That can happen in strange ways. As a woman, I can't shake hands with Iranians. And I was trying to find some ways to find common grounds, because all you can do as a woman is sort of put your hand across your chest and nod, and if you're in a room full of men, you begin to look like a Marx Brother routine, right. Going like this around the 20 men that are standing in the room. So I was with my counterparts, Abbas Arachi and Majid Ravanchi, one day, and we were chatting, and I said, I decided I'd take this head on. And I told them I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, in a Jewish community. I was Jewish, which I think they already knew. And that I grew up among Orthodox Jews as well, and I couldn't shake their hands. So here I was with Iranians having a discussion about Orthodox Judaism, a country, Iran, who believes Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth, and the Holocaust didn't happen. But it created this common ground of culture. So I think it doesn't mean, though, that you then don't go in the negotiating room and be tough as nails. Because you're there to take care of your country's security interests. So I think your point is the right one, Nancy, which is developing personal relationships is essential in anything in life, quite frankly, in anything. But you can't lose sight of what you're trying to accomplish. Diplomacy is not, with all due respect to Joan Nye, whom I adore, and is the author of Soft Power, there is nothing soft about diplomacy. If it's done right, it is tough, it is smart, it is focused, and it gets results.
This is my last question because I want to throw it open to the room. So, and there were microphones set up for those of you who want to start moving into position. But I want to ask you about anger, and particularly when women get angry and public women get angry. You talked about a point when the negotiations had really hit a wall where you were furious, and yet you found your anger was coming out in the form of weeping, like somehow the circuits got crossed.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of women who've had a version of that experience. So can you talk a little about anger and
Sure.
how that works on a public stage particularly?
So the real point of this story is that each of us is most powerful when we are our authentic selves. If we try to be other than who we are less powerful. So here I was on day 25 of what was 27 days in the last round of negotiations at the Palais Coburg in Vienna. Had not had much sleep. I was supposed to come here actually in September to be an IOP fellow and a Belfer fellow. And we had gone over the timeline. The Congress was going to do a 60-day review period, so I knew that I was never getting to Harvard in September. So the Iranians had really screwed up my life. And here I was, night of the 25th, myself and Rob Malley, my deputy, just a fantastic guy, sitting opposite Abbas Araghchi and Majid Ravanchi, my counterparts, negotiating the UN Security Council resolution. And the US always has held the pen on those resolutions, so this was just a bilateral negotiation between us. And I had put a piece of paper on the table with some formulas I thought would work. And Abbas Araghchi said, I think this will do it. And I thought, this is fantastic. I won't get to Harvard on time, but I may actually get there someday. And then, as the Iranians always did, Araghchi leaned forward and he said, except one more thing. And I lost it. I started yelling at him and saying, not only have you screwed up my life, I don't know if I used the word screwed up, but I might have. I was so furious. But you were putting this entire deal at risk, because this was the last big substantive issue. Somewhere when I was young, I learned women can't get angry, but women can cry. And I've tried over the years when I get angry not to cry. I dig my fingernails into my hand. I try to take deep breaths. I cannot stop myself from crying. I can't. So I was yelling and crying, and Rob was just quiet. He didn't know what the hell to do with me. Neither did Abbas Araghchi or Majid Ravanchi. They thought they'd figured out their way around me. They didn't know who the hell this was across the table. So there was a moment, and then Abbas said, okay, we're done. So it's not the easiest story to tell because it's, I'm telling it on myself. And I've had many women come up to me and say, same thing happens to me, I'm not allowed to get angry. And so they just don't get angry at all, or they cry. And it is what it is, and the only point of the story is we are our best selves when we are who we are. And one of the two people who really have taught me that lesson the most, and I'll just stop after this, are my father, my parents, and Barbara Mikulski. And the story on my parents is at a Rosh Hashanah sermon in the 60s, our rabbi who had gotten arrested for trying to integrate Gwynn Oak Park in Baltimore had been arrested, and he thought he owed his congregation an explanation about why he got arrested. And he said, when I was a chaplain, and I was at Dachau in the liberation, I tried to think what ministers and priests said to their congregations about the Jews during this time. And it made me think what my responsibility was for the discrimination that goes on in our community. And I thought my responsibility is to end discrimination in Baltimore. My father was very moved by that sermon and went to see the rabbi. My father was in residential real estate, and he asked the rabbi what he could do to help. And the rabbi said, well, you could advertise all of your houses open housing. There were no open housing laws in those days in Maryland or nationally. And my father said, well, if I do that, I'm going to lose my business. And the rabbi said, well, you asked what you could do. This is what you can do. It's terribly powerful. Right. So he talked to my mother, and they did it and took us on marches and all of those other things. By 1968, my father's business was closed. Within 6 months, he had lost 60% of his business. But he and my mother never regretted what they did. It was truly who they were and what they believed in, and an understanding that courage comes at a price, comes with a price. It led to other wonderful things. My dad became the head of sales and marketing for Columbia, a new town that was being created in Maryland that was meant to be integrated in every way possible. And it taught me a tremendous lesson. And the other quick story is very good friends with now former Senator Barbara Mikulski, and I ran her first successful campaign for the US Senate. And she's 4'11". Now she's a little less than that. That's what happens when you get older. And as I write, she is, the nicest way I can say this, which she thinks is pretty funny, she's comfortably round. And she's short, she's like a fire plug. And when she ran, she was running against two men, both of whom, a sitting governor and a very popular congressman from Montgomery County, very wealthy county in Maryland. They were tall, they looked like senators. And she said, she knew that togas didn't come in size 14 petite. That's the size she was then. But this is what a senator was going to look like. And she inhabited who she was and never tried to be other than who she was. And it made her a great and incredibly successful senator.
Wow. With that, I throw it open to the floor. You all know the rules. Please identify yourselves. Keep it concise, and questions should end with question marks. So please.
Hi, I'm Lori Scott. Can you hear?
Yes,
Yes,
hi.
a relatively new member of Leadership Council at the CPL.
Thank you.
And I'm so pleased to be part of this group, welcoming you, Ambassador Sherman, as the incoming director of the CPL, and your background and credentials and accomplishments are so truly impressive. And I've been reading your book, and I wanted to ask what the lessons in courage, power, and persistence, how these important traits translate to and are supportive of the teaching and practice of outstanding leadership in these very turbulent times.
Well, thank you, Laurie, and thank you for your support for CPL and for your leadership. I think, that's what Nancy and I have been talking about. I think there are lots of lessons for all of us, and probably these days, I've probably talked more about persistence than anything else, because it is such a hard time, and it's so easy to lose hope and to feel like nothing is going to move forward. But you look at the people here at the Kennedy School and the students and their enthusiasm and their vibrancy and their commitment to do something, to change something, to social justice, to finding a better way forward. And that's a very hopeful thing. So that discussion could go on forever. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kiana. I'm a first year here at the college. You mentioned early on you talked about the anxiety that arises with globalization and increasing encounters with difference, and you pointed out that Donald Trump's capitalizing on that anxiety hasn't done much to heal it. I was wondering, how do we go about healing that anxiety, and how do we, in your opinion, get people to stop seeing diversity as a threat?
Well, you know, I think the folks who feel left out and left behind have reason to feel that way. And I don't think we've spent enough time. We've never had a real trade adjustment assistance program in this country. We haven't done much. You know, I loved the idea that community college would be free, that people would be able to retrain themselves. We've never really figured out in this country, you know, this is the country that thought up night school, which was a phenomenal invention that allowed people who worked during the day to go to school at night and take themselves to the next step. We haven't figured out what are those next steps, and the biggest challenge, since you're just beginning here at Harvard, is your future is going to be a future of artificial intelligence, where the job market of today is going to look nothing like the job market that you will face, that you will live in. Great things will be created, but lots of things are going to disappear. And one of the great challenges for leadership, which I don't see at the moment, is thinking about what's that world going to look like? How do we plan for it now? What should we be thinking about to ensure that we don't create another generation of people who feel left out and left behind? This isn't the majority of our country. I want to be really clear about that. The majority of this country is very fortunate, but whether it is that white guy in the middle of our country or the African American in the inner city who feels like they can't walk anywhere, they can't do anything without being suspect or thrown in jail, our criminal justice system is broken, or the immigrant who is afraid to go to vote for fear that even if they're a naturalized citizen, they're going to be deported. So it cuts across in different ways, but we are an incredibly prosperous country, and we ought to be able to think ahead to help people make sure they don't feel left out and that we create a system of justice. So I'm counting on you. Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Vandanika. I'm a first-year MPP at the Kennedy School. Thank you for your candid conversation. I was wondering if you could share your reflections on the progress made or lack thereof in intergenerational support for young women to enter politics and diplomacy. So having powerful women like yourself in the field, how has that shaped the barriers to entry or the barriers to rising up the ranks for young women, and how will that play forward?
It's better. You know, it's sort of absurd that it took until 2011 for there to be an Undersecretary of Political Affairs who was a woman. However, by the time John Kerry was Secretary of State, all of the regional assistant secretaries at the State Department except one were women. All of the undersecretaries except for one, maybe two, were women. When we sat around the national security table in the Situation Room, Susan Rice was the National Security Advisor, Lisa Monaco and Avril Haines were the Deputy National Security Advisors. We had an unwritten rule in the room. We'd all experienced this enough that we didn't have to spell it out. When Lisa might say something brilliant, which he always did, and nobody paid much attention, and 15 minutes later, a guy said the same thing, and everyone thought he'd, created sliced bread. One of the rest of us would speak up and say, it is great that, I'm going to use a name that wasn't at the table, it was great that Talbot made the point that Lisa did and reinforced what she said. It is critical for women to do those kind of things, to create support networks. Everywhere I have worked, I have created a network of women that I can talk to, not just to bitch, moan, and complain, which is fun and necessary, and go drinking with, all useful, but to actually support each other. In Washington in particular, and this woman here, she was editor of Time magazine in a field where women get to be reporters, but not much else. Not much else. So it's as bad in publishing as it is in national security. So we have to help each other get the best jobs. In Washington, there is a boys' club. I know David will attest to this, Mark will attest to this. And when there's a job opening, they recommend each other. I have gone up to men and say, recommend me. Put me on your list. I'll put you on my list. But we have to do these things in a very conscious way. And the last thing I'll say is, power is not icky. Power is wonderful. It is icky when it's used for bad purposes and used badly. But women need to be comfortable with power and understand how to use it effectively and well to move things forward, to solve problems, to create justice. It's not in and of itself an ugly, horrible thing. It just becomes that all too often. I hope that helps.
You're here. Chuck.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Sherman. Thank you for the conversation. I'm curious, you mentioned during the conversation about your frustration with some on the other side of the aisle, with some back in the United States who were criticizing you for even interacting, negotiating with Iran, let alone coming to the deal, and obviously everything that's happened since 2015. In a similar way, we see criticisms of President Trump and his administration for going to North Korea. And I was wondering if you could compare and contrast the two, and then maybe speak a little bit to what level of deference we owe an administration and representatives from the administration when they're talking with foreign powers.
It's a good question, and it's not an easy one to answer. I mean, it's why, when I was asked about the Singapore summit, I said, I support the president doing this because of who he is, who Kim Jong-un is. Maybe it will disrupt the situation and we'll find a path forward, but I would also recommend he do these other steps simultaneously or it will come to naught. So I think where it is our national security, we owe it to speak the truth. I think the point, if I may, that Nancy was making earlier is true, however. We are at such a fraught time, the stakes are so high, that one has to speak truth when you disagree as well. And hopefully not in a way that leads to violence. But the stakes are unbelievably high right now for everybody. So where I can say positive things, I try to. I try to be an honest analyst. But if it's only at a tactical level, and the overall objective is mean, ugly, dispiriting, won't protect our country, I need to have courage to say that too. Sure.
Yeah.
Jay Gleason, you were on the Democratic Party Convention Platform Committee, and you said at the time that Hillary Clinton told you to make sure that the Democratic platform was pro-Israel, which meant that the amendment that was offered by Cornel West and James Zogby about Israel's illegal occupation and settlements was left out. Now, I don't understand why, if you're so concerned about discrimination and justice, why the platform is so one-sidedly biased in favor of Israel and its occupation. Palestinians aren't being given due process or due consideration within the Democratic Party any more than the nomination process was fair either. As we know, it was rigged in favor of Clinton, just like the platform was rigged. Doesn't the Democratic Party have some soul searching to do too?
Of course we do. Every party has soul searching to do because the Democrats like to think of ourselves as having a big tent and being open to new ideas, and I agree with you that sometimes we're not as open to those new ideas as we ought to be. I think that we have seen, because of what Bernie Sanders in particular did, that the Democratic Party has shifted left. I'm not sure it's left. They've just shifted on some key issues that are perhaps more progressive or different. And I applaud what he did to try to open that up. Where Israel's concerned, that's a really long conversation about the words that get used in a platform and the meaning of those words. But I quite agree with you that the Palestinians' cause and their right to have a state of their own is completely been set aside, and it is absolutely crucial I'm now a trustee of the International Crisis Group, which I think is just a phenomenal organization that does superb research. And Sippy Livni is now a trustee as well. And we had a really vigorous discussion at the trustee meeting in New York last week about where things are, which is pretty pathetic and pretty miserable and dispiriting and very, very, very disturbing. So on your fundamental point about the rights of the Palestinian people, I'm in complete agreement.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Gibbs. I'm Najm Meshkati, a professor of engineering and international relations at USC. I am here on sabbatical as a Belfer Fellow in managing the Atom program. Ambassador Sherman, I'm one of your staunchest fans, I can tell you that. And I'm Iranian American. I will shake and kiss your hand for what you did.
Thank you.
And I bought your book, by the way. It's excellent.
Thank
and
you.
I would recommend that to I would recommend that to particularly the young students here. That paragraph about the difference between diplomat and autocrat, it's seminal. It's classic. I'm, again, as a professor, I'm not in the business of complimenting people. Grading. I will grade,
But
and
you
you
do it
get
very
an,
well.
I'll remember that when I become a professor in January.
You get an A+ from me for that.
Thank you.
And I was, again, one of your fans since 2009 when I was a Jefferson Science Fellow at the State Department in the Office of Science and Technology, advisor to the Secretary. And I always admired you. Then October 2013 came. And in one of the hearings before the Congress, you made that DNA remark that deception is in Iranian DNA. My daughter, Shireen, that she was a law school student at USC, I said, have you seen that in my DNA, deception? It broke my heart, Ambassador Sherman.
Yes.
And as a diplomat, as a seasoned diplomat, as an admired diplomat, what happened?
I screwed up.
Thank you. I got my answer.
I was in a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing. It was either Senate Foreign Relations or banking. I can't remember off the top of my head. And it was an answer to a senator who was being very tough on Iran. And I said, deception is in their DNA. And as soon as it was out of my mouth, I knew it was really stupid and wrong. And it led to people literally on the streets of Tehran saying death to Wendy Sherman, which made my family really happy. And it led to many of the diaspora writing to me and saying, what are you saying? So I arranged for a Voice of America interview in Persian to ask me about it. And I said that I regretted having said that it was wrong. But, we all make mistakes, even people who write great books. And the important part about making mistakes is to apologize and to name what you've done when the time comes. It's not easy to do, but it's important to do. So thank you for raising it. And I personally regret very much that I said it. Thank you.
Just a final question. Oh, all right. 2 questions.
Okay, first of all,
Love your hair.
thank you. Looks like yours. No wonder you like it. Before I tell you who I am, you did what I have taught people for years: mess up, fess up, dress up. So
Good.
you messed
I
up,
like it.
you fessed up, and you said what you're going to do so it doesn't happen again. My name is Karen Kalish, and I am a serial social entrepreneur in St. Louis. But I was here at the Kennedy School and got a degree in 2000. Stayed a second year because I loved it so much, non-degree. And I just was in campus today to see all the new buildings and saw you were speaking, and so I'm here soaking it up, pretending I'm still in the Kennedy School. My
Welcome.
question is, you mentioned what happens if the Democrats take the House, but I was wondering about what happens if they don't. and some of the other scenarios that could happen?
I think if the Democrats don't take the House, it will be a really dismal time as well. Just a different kind of dismal. And the president will believe that he is all-powerful. He will not change his ways one bit. He will feel he is on his way to re-election, and he may well be. I can write the narrative for the president's campaign. Unemployment at 3.7%, got the North Koreans to stop going to war. Even though the president created the possibility we'd go to war, I stopped war with North Korea. I've gotten our NATO allies to pay more money. I've taken on the Chinese. I'm tough. I can go down the list of things. So I think we will all have to really persist, those of us who believe that the president is a short-termer, I don't think the president is a dictator. I don't think he is a fascist. But as my dear friend, former boss and colleague has said, Madeleine Albright, in her new book, Fascism, he is the least democratic leader in her lifetime and the least democratic leader in my lifetime. And that's an analytical point because democracy requires you to understand the past, consider the present, but you have an obligation to the future. And he does not proceed that way. It is about today. It is about winning right now. It is about, I think it's Ronnie Heifetz's book that talks about the difference between domination and authority. And autocrats are domineering and dominating. It's not about authority. Authority is essential in an organization, it's essential in governments, it's essential in life to organize societies, but it's quite different than an attempt at domination. So I think it will be a very hard and rough time, and we will all, who believe in a better way, will have to truly persist. And get out the vote. Yes.
Ambassador Sherman, it's been a pleasure listening to you. As somebody who's keenly observed the 2016 election, and I'm Indian, but we've seen a rise of this particular movement all across the world where the majority, in terms of the population, has generally been feeling disgruntled and neglected. I'm just curious as to how you think that particular sentiment, that anxiety can be assuaged while also reconciling that with the need for, say, affirmative action or corrective measures for historically disadvantaged groups. Because as we've seen, merely outrage or ignoring that anxiety is not a very smart political strategy. So what do you think is the way forward in such a scenario?
It's hard. And I don't think we have all the answers. As you were speaking, I was thinking, when I was here as a fellow, Ta-Nehisi Coates came and spoke. And we had a discussion about reparations and about how one deals with historical injustice. It is not, I have no easy answer. It is something we all have to struggle with to figure out what is the just way forward. And Cornell Brooks, who's here tonight, he and I were having a discussion earlier today, former head of the NAACP and now at the Center for Public Leadership, that we have to bring everybody to the table to think about the way forward and have a plan with a timeline and a way ahead that produces results. People have to see results. It's not sentiment only, makes you feel good for 5 minutes. You have to have a result. And that's sometimes hard to make happen. But we have to keep trying.
Ambassador Sherman, I am tremendously excited at the prospect of your full-time arrival in January to take up David's important work, join with all of the energy here in the cause of public leadership. You've been an inspiration to so many people, and I'm very grateful for the time you spent with us tonight.
Thank you, Nancy. Likewise. You okay? Cold, so I'm very grateful. Very grateful.